Okay, so if we're ready to start, hi everyone. Welcome to the Tennessee School for the Deaf Teachers and Parent Advisors program here. We host a monthly event called Meet a Deaf Professional. And so for this month, the month of August, we have a huge honor of having this person, Dr. Sarah Sparks. So I realized before we get going, I should have introduced myself too. So my name is Briella Diaz, and I'm the coordinator of this program. So welcome to everyone. I'm excited you're here. And we will have some time for question and answers and thoughts and comments at the end of the presentation. So if you can hold those until we get to that point. So right now, we want to get to know Dr. Sparks a little bit more. So Dr. Sparks, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? What's your background?
Sure. So I am a deaf clinical audiologist. I hear with 2 cochlear implants and I communicate in both ASL and spoken and written English. One thing that I do like to say up front at just about every talk that I give is that the reason my speech is so good is that I was not born deaf. I actually have a progressive hearing loss. So I developed spoken language before I became deaf. And the reason I start presentations out with that is I want you to be able to focus on what I'm saying and not just be thinking, wow, her speech is amazing. The reason that it's amazing is that I didn't have to work hard to develop it. So that's important context for me about my story. A little bit more just about myself. I currently live in Washington, D.C., and I am doing 2 things for work right now. For one thing, I have an online practice called Audiology Outside the Box. And in that practice, I do online auditory rehabilitation in English and ASL bilingually. And I do audiologic counseling and community education about audiology. And I recently just changed my day job. That's in addition to that. I was working at the Gallaudet University Hearing and Speech Center doing cochlear implant, hearing aid, and diagnostic services. But this past Monday, I started my new job as an educational audiologist for Baltimore City Public Schools. And I'm very excited about that job. The first week so far has gone great. So I am very happy about that. I'm originally from Eastern Kentucky, and I grew up in Eastern Kentucky. I went to college in Eastern Kentucky for my undergraduate education. I originally had a different career before I became an audiologist. I was a theology and religious studies teacher for 8 years before I decided to change careers.
Wow. Okay. So what made you feel like you wanted to make that transition?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I had felt for a while that teaching theology and religious studies was not the best fit for me. I enjoyed it, but there were aspects of it that made me say, you know, maybe this is just going to be a temporary thing in my life. I don't think that this is what I'm actually called to do with the rest of my life. So either fortunately or unfortunately, depending upon how you want to look at it, I had a significant period of illness related to a chronic illness that I have for a year, and I had to take a year completely off work. And during that time, I just did a lot of soul searching and thinking, what do I really want to do with my life? And if I get past this rough period in my life, do I want to take the plunge and make a career change? And the more I thought about it, the more I discussed it with my spouse, the more I really considered deeply what I felt a sense of call to do in my life. I ended up landing on audiology, and part of that is that I think it's really important for audiologists to be able to sign with deaf and hard of hearing clients. I know that in my experience of seeing audiologists, I had never had an audiologist who signed with me, and that really stuck out to me in my mind. And the other thing was audiologists don't only do things related to hearing. Balance is another part of our scope of practice. So the ear is involved in balance, which I think is a really cool thing. Interesting fact, your inner ear has 5 organs for balance, but only 1 organ for hearing. So really your ear is
I'm
more
sorry,
for balance.
could you repeat that one more time? 5?
5 organs for balance and only 1 organ for hearing. So really, if you think about it, your ear is more for balance than it is for hearing. So I just think that's a very cool thing about the ear, and the balance aspect of audiology was another aspect that made me want to get into it. Deaf and hard of hearing kids, as we do more research on that population, we're finding out more and more that there are significant problems with balance, even if they're not obvious. And I was just fascinated with that and wanted to get into that area of audiology as well.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us a little snapshot, a little snippet of your background and, why you're here and what led you to become, involved in this career. So those are good things to know. So our topic for tonight is an interesting topic: audiology and deaf culture, and how the two of those intertwine and coexist with each other. Oftentimes there are people out there that might say, oh, if a child has hearing technology like hearing aids or a Baha or cochlear implant, they can't be involved in the deaf community or with deaf culture. And those are like two different things. So I was just curious about what was your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think the idea that audiology and deaf culture don't mesh is a really narrow-minded idea. I think there's definitely room for both in a person's life. And it really depends on what's important to the individual. There are some people who don't want audiology services, and that's fine. I don't see my job as an audiologist as being, let's give everybody hearing technology and make sure that all the deaf people can hear. That's not what I do. What I value most about my work is that I'm able to empower people with knowledge about their own bodies and their own communication so that they can make their own informed decisions. And so that when children are little, that their parents can make those informed decisions, and then encourage the children as they get older to start taking on some of those decisions for themselves. So I think that audiology services are really optional in a deaf or hard of hearing person's life if that person has a language. Language is really the most important thing. But I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that there are deaf and hard of hearing people who communicate primarily in ASL, but they use audiology services for other reasons. So for example, a deaf person might want to use hearing aids just to listen to their favorite music, or just to have environmental awareness while they're riding their bicycle at night, or to hear certain favorite sounds that they have. I love working with deaf clients who use hearing aids because often they will have very specific goals that they want to use the hearing aids for. It won't be quite the same as working with a client who is, let's say, an older adult who grew up hearing but has lost some hearing over time with age. That sort of person will tell the audiologist, I want to hear better. That's why I'm here. But what I really love about working with signing deaf clients who use hearing aids is that often they have very specific goals for their hearing aid use. They'll tell me, there's a certain kind of music I really like to listen to, or I work in a job where I need to speech read people sometimes, even though I don't typically use spoken language to communicate. Or the example I gave before, I like to ride my bicycle at night and I like to be able to hear what's happening in the environment when I do that. So those kinds of goals, I think, are just really fun to work with as an audiologist, because you don't typically see an audiologist who's focused on optimizing hearing aids for those purposes. It's usually optimizing them for spoken language access. And I just love the challenge of listening to what clients tell me their personal goals are for their hearing aid use or their cochlear implant use, and then optimizing their devices for those purposes.
Right. Yeah, that sounds really cool. And so leading from that, yeah, deaf people use hearing technology, and they have benefits from using that kind of technology. But when it comes to culture, some people feel like they're divided, like listening and spoken language. People who use listening and spoken language only belong to, quote, a hearing culture. They can't, mesh with deaf culture. And I know that some people might say that that's not true. And that's a very complex question, but I'm just curious about what your perspective is on the culture when it comes to hearing technology.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about this topic, both from deaf people and from hearing people. And one of the reasons for that is that for so many generations, what we have been told is that these are two separate things. That's the message that has sort of been drilled into our heads. And that's the message that parents of deaf and hard of hearing children still often get from professionals today, that you have to pick one thing. You have to either pick listening and spoken language with hearing devices, or you pick a sign language pathway that might be ASL or might be some sort of sign system that's not actually a sign language, or what have you. And I think that it would be wonderful if we could all move past that black and white way of thinking and consider that people are individuals and have their own preferences for communication. One of my favorite questions to ask clients is, when you're communicating exactly as you want to, in the ways that you communicate best, what does that look like? So tell me about situations in your life, what kinds of situations you're typically in, and if it were in your ideal world, how would you want to communicate in those situations? And then I try to match what I do with what that person is telling me. And that's one of the ways that I try to show my clients that, if you're part of deaf culture, it's okay to want to use hearing devices if that's something that you personally desire for yourself. Or if you are not part of deaf culture, but you have a little bit of an interest in that and you want to explore that as a potential part of developing your identity, that's okay too. These worlds don't have to be completely separate. I think if we leave signers for a moment and talk about people who tend to be more oral deaf or hard of hearing, I think on that side of the issue, there are a lot of folks who would be interested in learning more about deaf culture, learning more about sign languages, but feel a little bit intimidated by it for some of the same reasons that signing deaf folks sometimes feel a little bit hesitant about hearing technologies, because we've gotten all of this messaging about how they're opposites of each other. They don't really mesh. But I think what we really need is more people, professionals and just general community members who can look at the nuances of the situation and particularly give parents the message that it's not an either or thing. It's not a matter of an a la carte menu where you just pick one thing. There's so many opportunities out there, and what it's really all about is language and how a person is going to develop that best.
Yeah, I am so glad that you mentioned language, because that is the goal no matter what. No matter what modality the child prefers to use, the language is the most important that we want to develop. So related to that, I know oftentimes at home, in a home environment, we have a lot of parents here tonight. So we want to talk about how can they make their home environment the most accessible for language to happen. Of course, with signing, but also with listening technology. I'm just wondering, do you have any sort of tips or anything or recommendations on how to make a wonderful listening environment at home, or not just a listening environment, but a language environment?
Sure. Yeah. So let's start with language more generally. I would strongly encourage anyone who does not have one of these yet to set one in place, a family language plan. Um, if you don't know about family language planning, there are some different places that you can get resources on that. The Laurent Clair National Deaf Education Center at Gallaudet University has some resources on that. And there are other places as well that I could send Briella an email and tell you all some of those resources to look up on your own time. But essentially, if you haven't heard of a family language plan, it's a plan that you set up as a family, and ideally involving the professionals that you're working with, that sets up a system for how you're going to do language and communication in your family on a regular basis. So some families will do family language planning where at certain times of day you do ASL, and at certain times of day you do spoken English. For other families, it will be maybe on Mondays you do ASL, and on Tuesdays you do spoken English for the whole day. And for some families, maybe it will be with one parent, the child communicates in ASL, and the other parent, the child communicates in spoken English. So there are a lot of different ways to do it. Family language planning is a really flexible thing. And if you work with a professional who has experience with it, you can really set up a good system where you feel good about how the plan meshes with what you're actually doing in your daily life. So I think actually planning either times of day or specific people in the family that the child is going to have a certain language and a certain type of communication with can add a lot more structure and help to ensure that the child is getting access to both languages pretty evenly. And it can also work for trilingual families and families that have more than 3 languages as well. There are a lot of different ways to do it. So I would certainly recommend that from a general language sort of perspective. But if we're talking about the more listening part, the more audiology type stuff, there are a lot of things that you can do to make your home environment more listening friendly for your deaf or hard of hearing child. One thing that you should know is that the microphones on hearing devices, hearing aids, and cochlear implants have what we call a critical distance of 6 feet. So if you're more than 6 feet away from your deaf or hard of hearing child, they're not going to hear you very well with their hearing devices. And even at a distance of 6 feet, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. But the farther you get away beyond 6 feet, the less likely it's going to be that they're going to hear you at all, because those microphones are not designed to pick up beyond 6 feet. So if you have an accessory with your child's hearing devices, such as a cochlear mini mic or a Phonak partner mic, or there are different accessories that go with different types of devices. If you have one and you don't know how to use it, you can ask your audiologist how to pair it with your child's devices. And what you can do is, when you're more than that critical distance away from your deaf or hard of hearing child and you want them to be able to hear you, you can wear that microphone and it will stream directly to your child's devices. Now, I would caution one thing on that. I would not recommend leaving it on all the time, because what that would mean is that anything you say at any time, it's going to stream directly to your child's devices. So let's say you get a phone call, you pick up the phone, you're wearing that device while your child is several feet away playing. They're going to hear what you're saying on the phone. So you don't want to.
Or if you go to the bathroom, they're going to hear that too.
Right, right. So anything that you say while you're wearing that and it's on, your child is going to pick up. So I would give that caution. And I would say as well that you don't want to wear your child out with listening. So it's not a good idea to leave it on all day, but I think it can be a good thing for certain kinds of situations. So let's say, for example, you're taking your child to the park and they're going to play with friends. You can wear the microphone and turn it off. And then when you want to call for your child, when you want your child to hear you, you can turn it on and then call for your child, and then they'll hear you. So that's just one example. but those technologies can be very, very helpful. Briella, did you want to add something?
No, I was just planning to ask you a follow-up question, but I wanted you to finish what you were saying first. So,
Oh, sure. There's just one other thing that I was going to mention. I know I'm giving kind of a long answer to this. You can also do
fine. No, it's good.
yeah, you can also do certain things in your home environment to make sounds easier to hear. So, one problem that deaf and hard of hearing people who use hearing technology struggle with a lot is reverberation. So that means that sound bounces off of things. And when it bounces, it echoes, it gets distorted, it's not easy to hear. So if you have a lot of hardwood floors in your home, there's going to be a lot of reverberation. One thing you can do about a hardwood floor is to put a rug on it, and the rug is going to absorb more of the sound. So if you use soft materials like rugs and pillows and canvas wall hangings in your home, those things are going to make a huge difference with sound absorption. And there's going to be less sound that reverberates and bounces off hard surfaces, which means it's going to be easier for your child to hear.
Wow, that's wonderful. Those are things I had no idea about, and I'm sure that our audience probably has learned something new too. That's very cool. Well, I want to follow up on one comment that you made about listening fatigue.
Mhm.
I know that is something that has come up previously in meeting a deaf professional in our events before. Can you expand a little bit more on that before we transition to our question and answer part?
Yeah, absolutely. Listening fatigue is a really common struggle for deaf and hard of hearing people who use hearing technologies. And it's because we have to work harder in order to understand what's being said. So it might seem like a person is able to understand what is being said, but they're probably missing more than you think they are. Essentially, our brains have to go into overdrive to make sense of what we're hearing with our hearing devices. And if that happens again and again and again throughout the day, we're just going to get exhausted and wear ourselves out. I know that very often in my own experience, I am ready for a nap by lunchtime. If I've had to do a lot of auditory listening rather than listening with my eyes during the day. So I would encourage parents to consider that that is going to be a likely issue in your deaf or hard of hearing child's life, even if your child is doing well with their devices, even if your child seems to understand what you say. One example that I sometimes give in presentations to talk a little bit about this is an exchange that I had with my spouse several weeks ago. There was a sentence that my spouse said that had the word tribal in it. They had watched a documentary about a tribal community or something like that, and they were starting a conversation with me about the topic. And when they first said the sentence, my mind started going through all of these possible words that could have been the word that was actually tribal. So like trouble, treble, trundle, truffle, and so forth. Yeah, my mind just trying to fill in all of the possibilities that this word could be because I didn't yet have context for what the word was. But within only about a second or 2 seconds, my mind landed on, oh, it's tribal. Tribal is the word. That's the word that was meant. And because I actually caught myself doing this that time, I paused and I asked my spouse, who is hearing, did you realize that I didn't understand what you said at first with the word tribal? And their response was, no, I never would have known. And that's really telling because my brain did so much work within that second to get to the point of knowing that that word was tribal. It's unreal. And I do that constantly throughout the day. And your deaf or hard of hearing child is doing that too. So this is how we get that listening fatigue. We get tired brains after doing this over and over again. throughout a day.
Yeah, and really, you grew up with a strong language foundation. So you have that ability to kind of figure that out. Is it that word or is it that word? And now I can imagine a child who is still acquiring language may not have that opportunity to, go through what word could it be? What sort of vocabulary word, what language? So it's even more of a challenge for a child, probably. So yeah, that's very powerful. And I'm really glad that you shared that. Okay, so now I think we're ready to transition over to question and answering part. So I want to let everyone know that we do have a lot of parents here and a lot of professionals here tonight, and we have a large number of people, larger than normal. So if you don't mind, please keep your questions simple and to the point. When you're ready for your question, go ahead and turn on your video or type your question in the chat. And if you decide to turn your video on, just give me a moment so I can spotlight you. And also, please be mindful of the interpreter. Make sure that you're not speaking super fast or if everyone's overlapping on their conversation. So let's just keep it one person at a time. So I tend to prioritize families to ask questions first. So any families here that has any question, we'll go ahead and answer those. And then if we have time left at the end of parents, we'll have the professionals ask questions. So are there any families that have any questions right now? Amy, hi. Oh, okay.
Hi. This was amazing. I learned so many new things. So thank you first for coming today. My question is on the family language plan and sharing that with your providers, which is a great call out. I've had two experiences, one with a not good provider and one that understood our language plan and collaborates with us. On that not so good experience, I stayed too long and questioned, oh, maybe I'm not right. Do you have any advice for if you share that plan with your provider and they're not on the same page, like what are good ways to dive into that and to really advocate for your child in those situations?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I think there are a couple of different things that you can do. One is if you have a resource on family language planning, you can actually share that with your provider, particularly if it's a resource written by another professional, and especially if you're talking to an audiologist, if it's written by another audiologist. People within their own professions tend to listen more to people in the same profession. I think that's somewhat unfortunate, but it is, in my experience, true. So there are some articles and resources on family language planning. I can send those to Briella after this so that she can share them with you all. And
that's great.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And if you want to share those with your provider, it would probably give them something challenging to think about because maybe they've never heard of family language planning, or maybe they've heard of it, but they've only heard of it in a really informal context and haven't actually seen it written about by a professional. So yeah, providing some of those resources is one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do is be straightforward with your provider about how you're feeling about what they say. I can say from my own perspective as an audiologist that I never want to cause any of my clients harm or emotional pain or anything else negative in any way. And that's something that I believe to be true about all of my colleagues as well, or at least the vast majority of them, even those who tend to have more of a bias toward listening and spoken language. I believe that genuinely my colleagues want to do well by their clients and by the children and the adults both. So if you're honest with them and you say, you know, I feel really invalidated by the way that you're approaching this, or you know, what you're telling me right now about this family language plan doesn't make sense given our experience. If you just straight up tell them that what they're saying is hurtful to you in some way, they're going to be more likely to listen. I think it can be really intimidating to tell a provider you've said something that's been really hurtful to me. And even as a provider myself, I struggle with saying that to my own doctors. Like when I go see my pulmonologist, for example, it would be really hard for me to have that sort of conversation. But I do think that because most providers want to do a good job, it's important for us to know when we're not. And personally, if I had said something hurtful to one of my clients, I would want to know so that I didn't do that thing again.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, for asking that question. That was great. I want to do a check. Dawn, do you want to fix your eye for a second? Give me 1 second. I'll be off and be right back. It's important to recognize the interpreters. Sorry, she hears me. That interpreters are people too. They're not machines. Great, thank you. All right. Are there any other parents that want to ask a question or any other family members that have a question? You can type in your question in the chat, or you can turn on your video, or you can just start talking if you don't want to turn on your video and the interpreter will hear you.
There's one in the chat.
Yeah, I saw that. That was a professional asking a question, but I want to prioritize the families first before we go to the professionals. If the families are finished, then I will go over to the professionals' questions. Okay, Carrie, go ahead.
Hi, I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say I really appreciate you and your perspective, like, so much. I started crying during your presentation. I'm like, you get it, you get it, you get it. And I just want to say I appreciate you so much and everything you've said and shared today. That's all. I just want to say that.
You're going to make me cry now. Thank you so much.
That was sweet. Thank you for sharing that. And I agree. It's really nice to have a professional that understands where you're coming from and being on the same page. Okay, so if there are not any other family members right now, we'll go on to professionals. But if you do have any questions at any time, go ahead and come let us know. There is a question in the chat. Tracy has asked, are all audiologists trained the same way for different ages? And also, oh, wait a minute. Also want to know if audiologists are qualified to make educational recommendations for what family language uses at home. Are they qualified to make those recommendations about access to speech and sound, assistive technology devices, or language acquisition? I'm just curious, maybe if you could summarize a little bit. I'm going to summarize. Okay, one more time, the question, last part. Sorry, it's a kind of a long one. It's a long question. But the bottom line is, why do some audiologists tell families what languages they should use? So why does that happen?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And it's something I used to puzzle over myself before I became an audiologist and actually became an insider to the audiology world. I was sort of dumbfounded by it. But one of the things I realized once I started school for audiology is that pediatric audiologists are few and far between. Audiologists who actually have very significant training in pediatrics, and even fewer and farther between are audiologists who have deaf and hard of hearing pediatric specific training. And I'll explain a little bit about why that is. So if you think about everything that audiologists are qualified to do, we work with a lot of populations. We work with older adults who have age-related hearing loss, which is one of the biggest populations. We work with members of the military who have noise-induced hearing loss, and that's actually the population that audiology started out to serve. It did not start out to serve deaf people. It started out to serve veterans after World War II. That's when the profession was born. We serve musicians for earplugs. We do custom earplugs for swimmers. We do intraoperative monitoring for people who have ear surgeries and brain surgeries, even hearing people who have those things done. We do so many things, and pediatrics is one very small portion of that. And if an audiologist is not specifically interested in that topic, they're not going to take a lot of continuing education in that topic, and they're not going to come up to date with best practices for working with children. And I also want to say that most of the children who see audiologists are actually hearing children, not deaf and hard of hearing children. So if you think about it, there are a lot of children who are hearing but get ear infections or need tubes in their ears or have a spoken language delay, but the audiologist needs to test their hearing to rule out they're being deaf or hard of hearing. Or there are children who have deaf and hard of hearing family members and they need monitoring, or they have some sort of health condition that is related to progressive hearing loss and that needs to be monitored. Or they need an audiologic evaluation as part of their journey to another diagnosis like ADHD or autism spectrum disorder. So all of those kids that I just described, there are a lot more of those kids in the world than there are deaf and hard of hearing kids. And that's why so many audiologists, even pediatric audiologists, don't have as much experience working with deaf and hard of hearing children as outsiders to the profession might think. Now, I specialize in working with deaf and hard of hearing children. That is my thing. But there are not that many audiologists in the world who would say the same. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So to get more to the heart of Tracy's question, audiology programs tend to focus on preparing students more for working with adults than working with children. And I would say, this is just my opinion, most audiologists are not qualified to make recommendations about the language that a particular child should have access to. I think many audiologists feel as though they are more qualified on that than they actually are. But in reality, AUD, Doctor of Audiology programs, do not have a class on language development typically. And the reason for that is that audiologists aren't typically working on language development things. We're working on things related to hearing and related to balance. But I would absolutely support the integration of more training in AUD programs about these topics. And I think even though deaf and hard of hearing children are only a very small fraction of the people that audiologists see, I think it's important for us to consider who we make the most impact with. Now, we do make an impact on those older adults, those military members, those musicians, and so on and so forth. But those folks already have language. And with deaf and hard of hearing children, we can make such an impact on their language development that even though there's such a small fraction of the people we see, the impact, I think, matters more than the numbers. That's just my opinion.
Thank you for answering that and explaining your perspective and your opinion and your professional opinion. I'm really glad that you made it clear, what is fact and what was your opinion. So yeah, thank you for that. So let's see. There are a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to go in order. So the next person, Sharon. Sharon Bryant has some questions. If you could limit to one question for now. Sharon says, well, I've got two, but thank you, Sarah. That was a wonderful presentation. Anyway, the two questions I have are, how old or what age is it that you started learning ASL? And the second question is, I am a profoundly deaf user of a hearing aid. Sometimes, like if I go to conferences and the speaker signs, or there might be an interpreter, and I look back and forth, but the noise in my hearing aid just from looking back and forth, and I tend to turn off my hearing aid so that I can focus on the speaker or the presenter 100%. Because with the hearing aid, it's distracting sometimes. So is that part of the brain processing, or is that part of the listening fatigue? Thank you, Sharon.
Yeah, so those are both fantastic questions. So to address the first one, my first exposure to ASL was actually in the 3rd grade before I became deaf. There was a deaf child who transferred from Kentucky School for the Deaf to my public school, and he and I became friends. And he was both a signer and a talker. And I got to learn from early on that deaf people are proud of being deaf, that deaf people have a culture, that ASL is an equal language to English. And I just feel so blessed that I got that knowledge from so early on because of my friend Jimmy, and he and I are still friends. And when I lost my hearing, he said, congratulations. Which I just adored, because he's so proud of himself as a deaf person culturally, and I'm really glad that he sort of brought me into that world. But I became more serious about learning ASL in my early 20s, I would say, and I am 36 years old now. So that's sort of my story with ASL. I got more serious about it as I lost more and more of my own hearing and became more and more deaf myself. And then the issue about listening with your hearing aids while listening to a presenter or something like that, there are a lot of different reasons that that can be exhausting. I experienced that with my cochlear implants myself. I sometimes feel very overwhelmed by the sound if I'm in an auditorium or if I'm listening to a lecture. I think part of that is the listening fatigue. Part of it is just me trying to focus and figure out what's going to be most accessible for me at those times. But there's also the fact that if you're in a lecture or presentation sort of situation in public, often that is being spoken through a microphone and amplified through loudspeakers as well. And having that amplification on top of the amplification that you get with your hearing aids can be a bit much for some people. Now, hopefully your audiologist has programmed your hearing aids such that they don't get loud enough to exceed what we call your uncomfortable listening level, or the level at which it would be intolerable for you to listen with. But even if the hearing aids are programmed with that in mind, sometimes listening to that much amplification for an extended period can be tiring. So I'm with you. I experienced that with my cochlear implants as well. And I program my own cochlear implants, so I know they're programmed like they should be.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sharon. All right, next question. One person has asked, you said 5 organs in your ear that focus on balance and 1 that focuses on hearing. Can you maybe clarify a little bit on that? What are those 5 organs?
Oh, I love to talk about this topic. It's one of my favorite topics. So in the inner ear, I don't know how many of you all have seen a picture of the inner ear, but you see this snail-like structure, and that's the cochlea, that's the organ for hearing. But then you see sort of a little pouch beside it, and then you see these 3 tube-like structures around it. That pouch and those tubes, those are the balance organs. So in that pouch, there are 2 organs that help us to sense what we call linear motion or linear acceleration. So that would mean motion that goes up and down or backward and forward. One of those organs is called the utricle, U-T-R-I-C-L-E, utricle. The utricle helps us to sense backward and forward motion. So if you're riding in a car, the reason you can feel that you're going forward is your utricle. The other organ that is for the linear motion is for the up and down motion. That is the saccule, S-A-C-C-U-L-E. So if you're riding in an elevator and you feel yourself going up and down in the elevator, that's because of your saccule. And then those 3 tube-like structures are called semicircular canals. And each one of those has a name based on where it is. One of them is the lateral canal. One of them is the posterior canal. And one of them is the anterior canal. And if you think about the way that they're angled, if you think about a picture of the inner ear, they're angled that way such that they correspond to different kinds of angled motions we do. So for example, if I take my head and I look upward and toward the right at the same time, that is stimulating 2 of my semicircular canals. So that's stimulating the anterior semicircular canal on my right and the posterior semicircular canal on my left. So, or for in my case, I actually have pretty significant vestibular dysfunction. So it's not stimulating those for me, but in a person who has typical vestibular function, it would be. But when we do angled motions like up and to the right or down and to the left, or if you're shaking your head while you're dancing, all of your canals are sort of active at the same time. And it's because of those organs that we can sense those motions and feel where we are in the world, in our environment. And if those organs don't work for you, either other senses can take over some of their function, or that function can just be lost depending upon the person.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that comment with another question. I'm kind of stepping over, but it's related. So I want to get a chance to do this. So what are some of the least obvious symptoms of balance challenges or problems with deaf and hard of hearing individuals?
Yeah, so this is a great question. This is something that I do research on, actually. I forgot whether I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that in addition to my Doctor of Audiology degree that I already have, I'm pursuing a second doctorate. I'm pursuing a PhD in Hearing, Speech, and Language Sciences. And the research that I'm doing for that is actually about deaf and hard of hearing children and whether the function of those balance organs, those vestibular organs, is related to their literacy. And the reason that I say this is that one symptom of vestibular dysfunction is what we call gaze instability, which means that when you move your head, your vision gets a little bit blurred. And if you have grown up with this and have never known any other way, you might not recognize that that's even happening to you. You might not even know that that's something that other people don't experience. And it's not necessarily a huge blurring. It's not as though people with dysfunction of those balance organs will move their head and then everything just gets all fuzzy. There's just such a subtle blurring that can occur, but it's enough that it can impact your ability to read things while your head is moving. And if we think about how children read, you know, they might have their head like this, they might be moving this way and that way and the other way while they're trying to read. And I'm very curious to know if that vestibular dysfunction has an impact on how much they're understanding from what they're reading. So that's something I'm working on researching right now. But that gaze instability is a really subtle symptom that a lot of people who are born with dysfunction of those balance organs wouldn't necessarily recognize in themselves.
Wow, thank you so much for pointing that out. That is something that I was not aware of, and I can think about that later on when when I work with families and children's that maybe that would cause a reading challenge. So thank you for that. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I'm not sure if we'll be able to get all of the questions answered tonight, but you can always try to contact me or email me your questions, and I can contact Dr. Sparks. Maybe she can write down all of the answers and I can distribute those out to you, or something that we can work out with Sarah. So Carrie had asked, is there any way to contact you to maybe pick your brain or something? I think this might be a great opportunity to talk about your audiology out of the box, and maybe they can follow and learn more about that. Can you explain a little bit more?
Sure. So my audiology outside the box business is an online practice, and I do a couple of different things with it. There's the clinical side where I can only see people in certain states because of licensing laws. Right now, I'm licensed in Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, and Massachusetts. I'm working on getting licensed in another state right now as well, but I'm not going to mention specifically which state it is because it hasn't happened yet.
Tennessee.
But there hopefully will be some legal changes in the next few years with regard to licensure laws. One thing you can do actually is encourage your state legislators to pass the Audiology Speech Language Pathology Interstate Compact. And what that would do would be allow audiologists who are licensed in compact states that have passed that compact, to practice online virtually with people who are in Tennessee. So I'm just putting that out there. That's something that you can do if you are interested in telehealth kinds of services like what I offer. But so on the clinical side, I offer what I call audiologic counseling and auditory rehabilitation. And a lot of that is answering people's questions that they have about their hearing devices, answering people's questions that they have about their child's use of hearing devices and their child's general language development as related to audiology topics. And I help people understand the parts of the cochlear implant and the parts of the ear. And there are various things that I do in that, but I can only do that with people in certain states. And then the other part of what I do is available to everybody. So I have a lot of free resources available on my website. I have active social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can see educational posts from me. So I post an educational post every Monday and Wednesday. And then I post a link to a resource I've created, a free resource that I've created every Tuesday and Thursday on my account. Sometimes I have a Friday post as well, but it just depends. So you can connect with me through those. You can also visit my website, which is audiologyoutsidethebox.com. I have a contact form where you can fill that out, and that goes to my professional email, and I will respond to you. And I would just ask you to keep in mind that there are certain things that I can't do and that I can't answer if I'm not licensed in the state where you are. And I am not, unfortunately, currently licensed in Tennessee, but I will help you in every way that I can. And if there is someone I know who is in your local area who could help you with the other things that you need that I can't do because of licensing limitations, I would refer you to that person.
Oh, sorry about that. I was trying to post the link to your website in the chat. Hang on one second. Okay, well, I think it's time to wrap it up. I want to respect the interpreter's time and Dr. Sparks' time. And honestly, I know this topic, we could probably stay here for another 3 or 4 hours or all night long even. We may ask you to come back again in a couple of months, or, we have really a lot of other deaf audiologists, and we have one here in Tennessee. So we may ask them to join our next presentation, just to meet a variety of deaf people. So I really want to thank you, Dr. Sparks, for your time, and really appreciate your explanation and talk about all the different information and resources that you've given, and just in general, your perspective, your knowledge, your wisdom. I really appreciate it. And people in the audience, if you're interested in watching this recording, feel free to contact me and I can send you a copy of the recording. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Bye. Feel free to show your video to say goodnight. Bye. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. It was great. Wow. Bye. Thank you. Thank you. Good night.